The morning sun filtered through the spotless windows of Maplewood Diner, casting warm squares of light across the checkered floor tiles. Daniel Carter stood outside his restaurant, taking a deep breath before entering. Today was different. Instead of his usual crisp suit and polished shoes, he wore worn jeans and a simple button-down shirt. His expensive watch was left at home, replaced by a basic timepiece from the department store. For 15 years, he had built Maplewood Diner from the ground up. What started as a small dream in a run-down building had grown into one of the most popular breakfast spots in town. The smell of fresh coffee and maple syrup usually brought a smile to his face, but today he felt oddly nervous. Something his friend had said last week kept nagging at him. You never really know a place until you've been there as a regular customer. The bell above the door chimed as Daniel stepped inside. The familiar sounds washed over him. The clinking of silverware, the gentle hum of conversation, the sizzle from the kitchen. But for the first time, he noticed something else. The subtle shifts in how people were treated. A well-dressed businessman at table 7 got immediate attention, while an elderly woman in simple clothes at table 3 had been waiting with an empty coffee cup. These were things he'd never noticed from his office in the back. Daniel chose a booth near the window, one with a clear view of the entire restaurant. The vinyl seat was cracked, another detail he'd somehow missed during his regular inspections. He watched as other customers were greeted with warm smiles and friendly chatter. Then Jessica approached his table. Her body language was different from what he'd observed with other customers. Arms crossed, chin slightly raised, eyes narrowed with suspicion. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. "You need to pay before you order," she said, her tone clipped and cold. The words hung in the air like frost. Daniel's chest tightened. He'd hired Jessica himself 2 years ago, impressed by her resume and friendly demeanor during the interview. Now he wondered how many times she'd done this before, how many customers had faced this treatment and simply never returned. "I'm sorry," Daniel said carefully, "but I noticed other customers haven't had to pay first. Is this a new policy?" Jessica's expression hardened. "We have to take certain precautions with some customers." Her emphasis on certain made its meaning clear. "And what kind of customers would those be?" Daniel asked quietly. Jessica's response came with a dismissive wave toward the door. "Look, if you're worried about affording it, there's a fast food place down the street. We don't do payment plans here." The conversations around them began to die down. A young couple at the next table exchanged uncomfortable glances. An elderly man, reading his newspaper, lowered it slightly, watching the scene unfold. Daniel noticed Mr. Harris, his manager, emerge from the kitchen. The moment Mr. Harris recognized him, his face went pale. "Mr. Carter!" Mr. Harris hurried over, almost tripping over his own feet. "Sir, I had no idea you were coming in today." The change in Jessica's expression was immediate. The color drained from her face as realization dawned. She still held her order pad, but her hands were trembling now. "Mr. Harris," Daniel said calmly, "I was just being informed about an interesting policy where certain customers have to pay before ordering. Could you explain this to me?" Mr. Harris turned to Jessica, his expression a mix of anger and dismay. "That is absolutely not our policy. Jessica, what were you thinking?" The diner had gone completely silent. Every eye was on their table, watching this drama unfold. Jessica opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Daniel raised his hand to quiet Mr. Harris. "Actually, I'd like to hear Jessica's explanation. Why did you assume I couldn't afford to pay for my meal?" Jessica's confidence from earlier had evaporated. I, I just thought, you looked, I didn't mean anything by it. You didn't mean anything by it, Daniel repeated softly. But you made a judgment about me the moment I walked in. How many others have you done this to? How many people have walked out of my restaurant feeling humiliated, feeling unwelcome? Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes. Mr. Carter, please, I'm sorry. It won't happen again. Daniel stood up slowly, his voice remaining calm but firm. You're right. It won't happen again. You're fired, Jessica. This isn't what Maplewood Diner stands for. This isn't what I built this place to be. Jessica's tears fell freely now. She removed her apron with shaking hands, folded it slowly, and placed it on the counter. Without another word, she walked out the door, the bell chiming one final time behind her. The silence in the diner was deafening. Mr. Harris stood awkwardly, shifting from foot to foot. Sir, I can't apologize enough. I had no idea this was happening. Daniel sat back down, suddenly feeling very tired. That's the problem, isn't it? We never know until we look through different eyes. He gestured to the chair across from him. Sit down, Mr. Harris. We need to talk about changes. For the next hour, Daniel and Mr. Harris discussed new training programs, anonymous customer feedback systems, and regular undercover visits. The other customers gradually returned to their meals, but the atmosphere had shifted. Something important had happened here today. As the morning crowd thinned out, Daniel remained in his booth, watching his diner with new eyes. He saw the small interactions, the subtle differences in how people were treated. He noticed which tables got immediate refills and which had to ask twice. Before leaving, he walked through the entire restaurant, introducing himself to every customer, asking about their experience. He learned more in those few hours than he had in months of reading reports from his office. That evening, after the last customer had left and the floors had been mopped, Daniel stood in the empty diner. The setting sun painted the walls in soft orange light, and he could still smell the lingering aroma of coffee and maple syrup. He walked to the front window and looked at the sign he'd proudly hung 15 years ago. Maplewood Diner, where everyone's family. Today had shown him that a sign wasn't enough. Good intentions weren't enough. Real change required constant vigilance and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. The next morning, a new sign appeared in the window. At Maplewood Diner, every customer is treated with respect, no exceptions. This is our promise to you. Below it was Daniel's personal phone number and an invitation to call him directly if that promise was ever broken. This story isn't just about a restaurant owner discovering discrimination in his establishment. It's about the blind spots we all have, the assumptions we make without realizing it, and the courage it takes to face those uncomfortable truths. It's about understanding that real change doesn't come from rules and policies alone. It comes from people willing to open their eyes and take action. Have you ever seen discrimination happen and wished you could do something about it? Have you ever been judged unfairly and wished someone would stand up for you? Share your story in the comments below. If you believe in treating everyone with dignity and respect, hit that like button and help us reach 10,000 likes. Subscribe to Real Life Stories New for more powerful stories that make us think, feel, and grow. Because sometimes the most important changes start with a single moment of truth. And the next story that changes lives might just be yours.